Life had always felt like a constant uphill climb. Every morning, as the sun began to rise, the weight of mounting debts pressed heavily on the mind. It wasn't just the bills, the overdue payments, or the constant worry of creditors knocking on the door. It was the feeling of helplessness that crept in at the start of every day. No matter how hard things were worked for, no matter how many hours were spent striving to make ends meet, it always felt like the effort was just a drop in the ocean. It was as if no matter how much was earned, it was never enough to erase the financial burden. Over time, it became more than just the pressure of owing money. It was the emotional toll, too. The shame of feeling like a failure weighed just as heavily as the numbers on the bank statement. Conversations with loved ones became strained, filled with silence or words of reassurance that felt hollow. It wasn't just about the lack of money. It was the sense of losing control over one's life, feeling trapped in a never-ending cycle. On this particular morning, as the light filtered softly through the window, it seemed as if the world was moving slowly. The tired eyes stared blankly at the kitchen table, the piles of unopened bills stacked next to an empty cup of coffee. There was no clear path forward, no obvious solution. It was as though life was passing by while everything stayed the same, and the hope of ever breaking free from the overwhelming cycle of debt seemed like an impossible dream. But in that moment, when the weight felt unbearable, an old memory surfaced. It was a story that had been shared many times in the family, a simple, ancient ritual that had been passed down for generations. It was said to be a path to peace, a way to break free from financial struggle. The ritual was simple. Each morning, for 20 days, a chapati had to be made. The chapati was then filled with honey and offered to a cow. It wasn't about the food, nor the act itself. It was the belief that such a ritual had the power to bring prosperity and end financial troubles. There was hesitation, of course. The logical side of the mind questioned whether it could really work. It seemed too simple, too unrelated to the complex problems that had accumulated over the years. But there was something about the idea of faith, the belief in something greater than oneself, that stirred a flicker of hope. Perhaps it was worth trying, even if only as a way to momentarily escape the crushing weight of the situation. The decision was made. The ritual would begin the next morning, despite all the doubts and uncertainties. What did it hurt to try? Maybe this was a sign, a small glimmer of hope to hold on to. After all, the hardest part of any journey was starting, and so, the first step was taken, by believing in something that seemed both old-fashioned and extraordinary at the same time. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden glow through the kitchen window. The world outside still slept, but inside, there was a quiet sense of purpose. With a deep breath, the decision that had been made the night before came to life. The ritual was about to begin. For the next 20 days, every morning would follow the same pattern. A chapati would be made, filled with honey, and offered to a cow. It sounded simple enough, but there was a lingering sense of uncertainty, a sense that this small, humble task couldn't possibly lead to the change that was so desperately needed. But that uncertainty didn't stop the hands from moving. The dough was kneaded carefully, each fold and press in the flour representing a moment of focus, a moment of hope. The motion was familiar, comforting, something that had been done 1,000 times before in kitchens across the world. As the chapati began to take shape, it was easy to momentarily forget about everything else, the bills, the debts, the weight of everything pressing down. For just this moment, there was peace in the simple act of preparing food. Once the chapati was perfectly round, it was cooked carefully on the hot tawa, watching as it puffed up with the heat. The scent of the fresh, warm bread filled the room. For a brief moment, the ritual felt like nothing more than a tradition, an old habit that was just being repeated. It was the honey that changed everything. The golden sweetness drizzled generously over the surface of the chapati, symbolizing the act of giving, of offering something good in the hope that something good would return. With the chapati now filled with honey, the real moment of decision arrived. Leaving the kitchen and walking out to where a cow was waiting. Walking outside, there was a mix of hesitation and expectation. The cow stood in the field, its calm gaze fixed on the world around it. In that gaze, there was no judgment, no expectations. It was simply a creature of the earth, steady and grounded, representing something ancient, something that connected all of nature. With each step toward the cow, a part of the mind was filled with doubt. What if this didn't work? What if this ritual, this offering, didn't have any magic in it at all? But just as quickly as the thought entered, it was replaced by something else. A quiet trust in the process, in the simple act of doing. Sometimes, belief didn't need to be loud or grand. Sometimes, it was simply a willingness to try, to follow through, even when the outcome wasn't clear. The chapati was offered to the cow, and the cow began to eat. It was a peaceful moment, one that seemed small in the grand scheme of things, but in that moment, there was a shift. There was a feeling that this act of giving, however small, was something that mattered. For a fleeting second, it didn't matter whether it would bring wealth or success. It was about the peace in the offering, about connecting with something larger than oneself. And with that, the ritual had begun. The first day was complete. There were no fireworks, no dramatic changes. But there was something more important. A sense of hope that was planted, a small seed that would grow in time. The days passed slowly, and each morning the ritual continued, making the chapati, filling it with honey, and offering it to the cow. At first, it felt like nothing had changed. The weight of debt still hung around like a constant shadow, and the uncertainty about whether the ritual would work remained in the back of the mind. But something was different, even if it was just a quiet feeling. There was a small shift in the way the mornings were approached, in the way the day was viewed. There was more patience, a little less anxiety, and more trust that maybe, just maybe, something could come of this. By the fifth day, there was an unexpected phone call. It was from a company the person had applied to months ago. The voice on the other end sounded warm, and after some small talk, they delivered the news. The job was theirs. A new opportunity was now on the table, one that promised stability, even if it wasn't a windfall. For the first time in a long while, there was a sense of relief. It wasn't the grand transformation that had been hoped for, but it was something real. The relief was enough to allow for a deep breath, one that had been held for months. But that wasn't all. Over the next few days, other small things began to fall into place. A check arrived in the mail, one that had been forgotten about for years. It wasn't much, but it was enough to cover an overdue bill, taking some of the pressure off. It felt like a small blessing, an unexpected twist in the story, like life was gently pushing back the cloud of worry, piece by piece. The feeling was hard to explain, almost like the universe was saying, "You're not alone in this." Each day felt a little less heavy, a little more manageable. But there was still doubt. Was it really the ritual, or was it just coincidence? The logical mind wanted answers, but the heart wanted to trust. After all, it had been 20 days of doing the same thing, with no sign of stopping, and each day felt like a small victory in itself. The feeling of hope grew steadily. It wasn't about the money that had arrived or the new job. It was the sense that, after all the struggles, something had finally started moving in the right direction. The stress that had once been all-consuming now felt more like a distant memory. The weight of the debts still lingered, but it didn't feel like they were impossible to overcome. The person had stopped fighting the day-to-day struggles and had started to take small steps toward a future that was more hopeful, more promising. One morning, as the chapati was made and the honey drizzled over it, the ritual felt different. The act was still the same, but now it carried a deeper meaning. It wasn't just about the cow, it was about faith. It was about doing something, no matter how small, and trusting that the effort would yield results. That trust was now part of the process. The ritual had slowly, subtly, woven itself into daily life. It wasn't magic that was changing things. It was a shift in perspective, a belief that things could be different. And in that shift, the world began to open up in unexpected ways. It was the morning of the 20th day. The ritual, though simple, had become a part of the daily rhythm, a grounding force in the chaos of life. For the first time in weeks, there was a sense of anticipation in the air, not about the ritual itself, but about what was about to unfold. The routine had been followed faithfully, each day a quiet testament to hope, patience, and belief. And now, on the final day, the weight of everything that had happened seemed to culminate in this one moment. The chapati was made as it always had been, soft and round, with honey filling the warm dough. But today, it felt different. There was a quiet sense of peace in the act, as if the days of waiting had somehow brought a sense of calm. The same cow stood in the field, waiting for the offering, and it felt as though this was more than just a simple gift of food. It was a gesture of gratitude, a way of acknowledging how far the journey had come, and how much had changed, both inside and out. When the chapati was placed before the cow, something profound settled within. It wasn't the magic of the honey or the act of feeding the cow that made the moment special. It was the transformation that had taken place, not just in the external world, but in the heart. The debts were still there, and the challenges weren't over, but the burden of them had lightened. The weight on the shoulders had shifted from oppressive to bearable, and for the first time in a long while, there was space to breathe. That afternoon, the phone rang again. The voice on the other end was familiar, one that hadn't been heard in years. It was an old acquaintance, someone who had been involved in a business venture that had long been forgotten. They had finally settled a matter that had been lingering for years, and it was now time to make a payment, a substantial one. The relief that flooded over in that moment was indescribable. It was more than just money. It was the sudden, unexpected clearing of one of the largest debts. The weight that had felt insurmountable was now, in an instant, reduced to something manageable. And then, there was the unexpected windfall. A letter, one that had seemed unimportant at first, arrived with the news of a grant, an opportunity to start fresh. It wasn't just the money, but the recognition that the path had opened up, as if the universe had shifted to align with the small acts of faith that had been carried out each morning. This wasn't just luck. This was the result of persistence, belief, and small steps taken every day. As the day drew to a close, the overwhelming sense of gratitude filled the heart. The debts were not completely gone, but they no longer felt like an endless mountain to climb. What had begun as a simple ritual, almost too insignificant to matter, had led to a profound change. It wasn't the ritual alone that had transformed things. It was the shift in perspective, the trust in a process larger than oneself, and the understanding that sometimes, transformation happens in the most subtle and unexpected ways. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a sense of peace, a quiet hope for the future. The road ahead was still uncertain, but now it felt full of possibilities. The weight of debt had been lifted, not because of any miraculous intervention, but because of the power of patience, faith, and the simple belief that good things would come with time. And with that, a new chapter began, a chapter filled with hope, promise, and the knowledge that sometimes, the smallest acts lead to the greatest changes.